Dust choked the thick, oppressive air of Oakhaven as the auctioneer's gavel prepared to slam down, sealing a fate worse than death. A bruised but unbroken native girl stood on the splintered wooden block, her dark eyes blazing with feral hatred at the leering crowd of prospectors and outlaws. Then, a voice like grinding stones cut through the clamor. $2. The mob parted for a towering mountain man draped in weathered buckskin and bear fur. He wasn't there to claim property, but she didn't know that. As he tossed the silver coins onto the stage, she locked eyes with him, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this. I won't obey." Oakhaven was a festering wound of a town carved into the edge of the Wyoming Territory. It was a place where men went to disappear, and where innocence was traded for cheap whiskey and gold dust. The year was 1874, and the scorching July sun beat down on the muddy main thoroughfare, baking the stench of manure, sweat, and cheap tobacco into the very wood of the saloons. Caleb Montgomery despised Oakhaven. A solitary trapper who made his home high in the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, Caleb only descended into the lowlands twice a year for salt, ammunition, and coffee. He was a man carved from the mountains themselves, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. He carried the scars of grizzly bear claws and harsh winters, but the deepest scars were the ones hidden beneath his rough wool shirt. Leading his pack mule down the chaotic street, Caleb intended to make his visit brief, but a raucous crowd gathered in the town square blocked his path to Bartholomew Finch's general store. Curiosity, a trait Caleb usually suppressed, drew him toward the fringes of the mob. A makeshift stage had been erected from old whiskey barrels and timber. Standing upon it was Sheriff Sterling, a man whose badge was merely a license for corruption. Beside the sheriff stood a girl. She was young, perhaps no more than 20, with long raven-black hair deeply tangled and a torn calico dress that spoke of a violent capture. The auctioneers called her Cora, a Western name forced upon her by the missionaries before she had fled back to the plains, only to be captured by outlaws. Her wrists were bound with coarse hemp, her skin bruised, yet she did not weep. Instead, she stood with a terrifying stillness, her chin raised, radiating a dangerous, silent fury. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Sterling bellowed, wiping sweat from his greasy brow, "we have a fine worker here today. Strong, resilient, found wandering near the Silver Creek claim. Who'll start the bidding?" Caleb felt a familiar, cold disgust knot in his stomach. He turned to leave, wanting no part in the vile affairs of lowland men. But then, a voice slithered through the crowd. 50 cents. Caleb stopped dead. He recognized that voice. It was smooth, mocking, and stained with blood. He turned back to see Gideon Croft, stepping out from the shadows of the saloon awning. Gideon was a notorious land baron and outlaw who operated under the guise of a legitimate businessman. He wore a pristine black suit that looked absurd in the dusty town, but the pearl-handled revolvers on his hips commanded absolute terror. Years ago, Gideon's men had burned a homestead to the ground, Caleb's homestead. Gideon wasn't looking at the girl with the usual lust of the miners. He looked at her with a calculated, desperate greed. "I have 50 cents from Mr. Croft," the sheriff announced, his voice trembling slightly. No one in Oakhaven dared bid against Gideon Croft. "Do I hear $1? Silence fell over the square. The miners shuffled their boots, looking away. Gideon smirked, stepping closer to the stage. Cora's eyes widened slightly as she looked at Gideon, and Caleb, trained to read the wilderness, read her face instantly. She wasn't just afraid of him, she recognized him. She knew something. Going once, Sterling called out, raising his gavel. Caleb didn't think. He acted on an instinct forged by years of surviving the unforgiving wild, driven by a sudden, burning need to deny Gideon Croft whatever prize he was after. $2, Caleb's voice boomed, deep and resonant, shattering the silence. The crowd gasped, parting like the Red Sea as Caleb stepped forward. Gideon's smug smile vanished, replaced by a scowl of pure venom. He turned, his hand hovering near his revolver, but paused when he took in Caleb's massive frame, the Henry rifle slung casually over his shoulder, and the massive hunting knife strapped to his thigh. "This is none of your business, mountain man," Gideon hissed. "Walk away." "Bid's $2, Caleb said calmly, not breaking eye contact with the outlaw. "You care to raise, Croft?" Gideon's jaw clenched. He was a man who preferred his violence done in the dark by his hired guns, not in the middle of a crowded square against a giant who looked like he wrestled bears for sport. "Keep her," Gideon spat, turning on his heel. "She's nothing but trouble anyway. But watch your back, trapper." Sheriff Sterling eagerly slammed the gavel down. "Sold! For $2 to the man in the furs." Caleb stepped up to the stage, pulling 2 heavy silver dollar coins from his pouch and dropping them into the sheriff's greedy palm. He drew his hunting knife, causing the sheriff to flinch back, but Caleb only reached out and sliced the thick hemp rope binding Cora's wrists. She rubbed her bleeding wrists, but she didn't cower. She stepped right up to Caleb, forcing him to look down into her blazing, defiant eyes. She didn't see a savior. She saw another master, another white man who had bought her like cattle. "You'll regret this," Cora promised, her voice a low, raspy whisper filled with deadly conviction. "I won't obey." "I ain't asking you to," Caleb grunted, turning his back on her. "Try to keep up." The ascent into the Bitterroot Range was brutal. The tree line swallowed them whole within hours of leaving Oakhaven, replacing the stifling heat of the plains with the crisp, biting air of the high country. Caleb rode his massive draft horse, leading the pack mule, while Cora was forced to walk behind. He hadn't bought her a horse. He hadn't bought her anything, save for a heavy wool blanket he tossed at her when the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, chilling shadows. For the first 2 days, Cora was a phantom of defiance. She walked until her feet bled, refusing to ask for rest. When Caleb offered her dried venison and hardtack, she snatched it from his hands without a word of gratitude, glaring at him over the dancing flames of their meager campfires. She was waiting for the inevitable. She was waiting for the mountain man to demand his money's worth, to lay hands on her, to force her into submission. She had already decided she would drive a sharp piece of flint through his neck the moment he tried. But Caleb did no such thing. He barely spoke to her. He didn't order her to fetch water, gather firewood, or cook. He did the chores himself in practiced, efficient silence. He treated her less like a servant and more like a stray, dangerous wolf he had foolishly allowed into his camp. On the 3rd night, they camped near a rushing alpine river. The air was freezing, hinting at an early autumn snow. Cora sat huddled in her blanket, watching Caleb sharpen his hunting knife by the firelight. The rhythmic shh of the whetstone against the steel grated on her frayed nerves. "Why did you buy me?" she finally demanded, breaking the 3-day silence. Her voice was hoarse, heavily accented but clear. Caleb paused, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. He didn't look at her. "Didn't buy you. Paid a toll to get you away from Gideon Croft." "You are no different from him," she spat, pulling the blanket tighter. "You think you own me. You think because you gave 2 silver pieces, my life belongs to you." Caleb slowly sheathed his knife and finally met her gaze. His eyes were devoid of malice, carrying only a weary heaviness. "Your life is your own, girl. Soon as we get to my cabin, you can take whatever supplies you can carry and walk whichever way the wind blows. But down in that town, you were dead meat." Gideon wasn't looking at a slave. He was looking at a loose end. Cora froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked away, staring into the roaring river. How could this wild man know? "I saw your face when he bid," Caleb continued, tossing a thick log onto the fire. "You know him, and he knows you." Cora debated lying. She had trusted no one since the mission had been burned, since she had been forced to guide the surveyor, Thomas, into the hills. But something in Caleb's stoic, unbothered demeanor chipped away at her armor. He wasn't pressing her. He was simply stating facts. "His men. They killed the man I was guiding," Cora whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "A man from the east. He was looking for rocks. He found silver. A mountain of it, hidden in a gorge. Gideon's men slaughtered him for the map, but they didn't get it," Caleb guessed. Cora tapped her temple. Thomas burned the map before they broke into the tent. I know the landmarks. I know the way. Gideon's men took me, but we were attacked by rival outlaws on the plains. I escaped, but the sheriff in Oakhaven found me. Put me on the block before Gideon could quietly take me back. Caleb sighed, rubbing his bearded jaw. So I bought a walking gold mine, or silver mine, for $2. No wonder Croft looked ready to skin me alive. I will not take you to it, Cora snapped fiercely, her hand instinctively drifting toward a heavy rock near her boot. I will die before I let another white man strip the earth of its bones. Caleb let out a short, dry chuckle that surprised them both. Keep your silver, girl. I got no use for rocks. All they bring is blood and greedy men to my mountains. He stood up, towering over her, and tossed her a heavy leather canteen. Drink. Tomorrow the incline gets steeper, and we need to move fast. Croft isn't the kind of man to let $2 stand between him and a silver vein. Cora caught the canteen, watching Caleb walk toward his bedroll. For the first time since she had been dragged in chains to Oakhaven, a tiny, fragile spark of hope flickered in her chest. Perhaps this mountain man was exactly what he seemed. Nothing more, nothing less. But her relief was short-lived. The next morning, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The temperature plummeted, and by noon, a fierce, blinding blizzard was howling through the pass. They were forced to abandon the trail and seek shelter beneath a massive rock overhang. The wind shrieked like dying animals, whipping snow into their faces with the force of shattered glass. Caleb practically had to drag the animals into the shallow cave, his hands numb and bleeding from the cold. Cora huddled in the corner, shivering violently, her lips turning blue. Despite her bravado, the mountain cold was a ruthless killer. Caleb secured the animals, then turned to her. He didn't ask permission. He pulled her roughly against his chest, wrapping his heavy bearskin coat around them both, trapping their body heat. Cora tensed, her instinct to fight flaring up, but she was too weak, too cold. She pressed her hands against his chest to push away, but his grip was iron. "Stop fighting me," he ordered over the howling wind. "Unless you want to freeze to death to prove a point." She stopped struggling. Beneath the rough wool of his shirt, she could hear the steady, powerful beating of his heart. It was terrifyingly intimate. She realized then that Caleb Montgomery was not a man who commanded obedience through words or a whip. He commanded it through raw survival. "If Gideon finds us," Cora murmured, her voice muffled against his coat, "he will kill you to get to me." "Let him try," Caleb said quietly. "I've been waiting for Gideon Croft to climb my mountain for 5 years. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping them in a brutal, icy limbo. When it finally broke, leaving behind a pristine, deadly white world, they emerged from the overhang, exhausted and half-starved. Caleb pushed them relentlessly upward, navigating treacherous, snow-blind passes with an uncanny memory of the terrain. On the 5th day of their journey, they crested a ridge, and Caleb pointed down into a secluded, snow-dusted valley. Nestled against a wall of towering pines sat a sturdy log cabin, smoke lazily drifting from its stone chimney. "Home?" Caleb grunted. The cabin was surprisingly well kept inside. It smelled of dried herbs, smoked meat, and aged wood. There were thick furs on the floor, a large stone hearth, and shelves lined with preserved foods and worn, leather-bound books. It was a fortress built by a man who intended to keep the world out. For the next few weeks, a strange, unspoken truce settled over them. Cora did not try to leave. The snow was too deep, the mountain passes too dangerous for a lone woman on foot. Instead, she began to integrate herself into Caleb's solitary life. She insisted on pulling her weight, refusing to be a kept woman or a burden. She learned to skin the hares Caleb trapped, she mended his torn coats with a bone needle, and she cooked thick stews from dried venison and roots. Caleb, in turn, built her a separate bed frame in the corner of the cabin, partitioning it off with a hanging elk hide for privacy. He never crossed that boundary. Through the long, dark evenings by the fire, the silence between them slowly transformed from hostile to comfortable. Cora began to study him. She noticed how carefully he handled the books on his shelf, reading by the firelight with a surprising gentleness. She noticed the deep, jagged scars on his forearms, burn marks that looked horrifyingly intentional. One evening, while Caleb was cleaning his rifle, Cora sat across from him, braiding her hair. "You told me you were waiting for Gideon Croft," she said softly, breaking the crackling silence of the fire. "Why?" Caleb paused, his oil rag hovering over the barrel. His eyes darkened, the winter sky in them turning stormy. He looked at the fire for a long time before he spoke. "Before I came to the mountains, I had a farm down in the valley, just outside a town called Red Creek. Had a wife, a little brother, barely 10 years old." Cora stopped braiding, her hands falling to her lap. She could hear the sheer agony tearing through his usually steady voice. "Gideon Croft wasn't a land baron back then," Caleb continued, his jaw tight. "He was just a common rustler leading a pack of coyotes. They wanted our land for the water rights. I refused to sell. One night, while I was out tracking a lost calf, they came." Caleb closed his eyes, taking a shuddering breath. "Burned the house down with them inside. When I got back, Gideon and his men were sitting on their horses, watching it burn. I tried to pull them out. That's how I got these." He touched the burn scars on his arms, but it was too late. "I managed to shoot 2 of his men, but Gideon put a bullet in my shoulder and rode off." Cora felt a heavy ache in her chest. She had thought his coldness was born of cruelty. Now she realized it was a fortress built around unimaginable grief. He had lost everything to the very man who had tried to buy her. "I tracked them for a year," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Killed 5 more of his crew, but Gideon disappeared into the east. By the time he came back, he had money. Lawyers, politicians in his pocket. He became untouchable. So, I came up here. Figured the mountains were better company than corrupt men. Until you saw him in Oakhaven," Cora realized. "When I saw him bidding on you, I didn't know who you were or what you knew," Caleb admitted, finally looking at her. "I just knew I'd rather burn my last dollar than let that bastard win. Buying you, it was a way to strike at him." Cora stood up, walked over to her side of the cabin, and reached into the lining of her torn original dress that she had discarded for one of Caleb's oversized shirts. She pulled out a small, blood-stained leather journal. She walked back and placed it on the table in front of him. "What's this?" Caleb asked, frowning. "Thomas's ledger," Cora said. "He didn't just find silver. He found proof that Gideon has been funding his empire by robbing federal payroll trains. He was going to take it to the marshals in Cheyenne. If Gideon gets this book, he remains untouchable. If the marshals get it, he hangs." Caleb stared at the little book, realizing the immense gravity of what sat on his table. This wasn't just about a silver mine. Cora was carrying the noose that could finally hang Gideon Croft. Before Caleb could speak, a sharp, unnatural sound echoed from outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the distinct crack of a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot. Caleb instantly blew out the oil lamp on the table, plunging the cabin into darkness lit only by the dying embers of the hearth. He moved with terrifying speed, grabbing his Henry rifle and pressing his back against the wall next to the window. "Get down!" he hissed to Cora. She dropped to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crawled toward the hearth, grabbing the heavy iron poker. "How?" she whispered frantically. "The snow. It covered our tracks." "They didn't track us," Caleb said grimly, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. In the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow, he could see the dark silhouettes of at least a dozen men surrounding the clearing. They hired a Shoshone tracker. "I should have known Croft wouldn't let the weather stop him." A voice called out from the darkness, echoing off the trees. "Caleb Montgomery." It was Gideon Croft. His voice was laced with smug triumph. "I know you're in there, mountain man. Throw the girl and the book out the door, and I might just let you die quick. Refuse, and we burn you out, just like old times." Caleb pulled the hammer back on his rifle. He looked down at Cora in the dim light. The defiant, unbroken girl from the auction block was still there, but now there was something else in her eyes. Trust. "You still planning on not obeying?" Caleb asked softly, a grim smile touching his lips. Cora gripped the iron poker tightly, her dark eyes flashing in the firelight. I never obey men like him. Let them come. The deafening roar of Winchester repeaters shattered the mountain silence, followed instantly by the terrifying sound of lead tearing through solid pine. Wood splintered violently inward. Jars of preserved berries exploded on the shelves, raining glass and dark red syrup across the floorboards. Caleb didn't flinch. He operated with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had lived this nightmare before. He slid a heavy wooden beam across the reinforced oak door, dropping the latch with a resounding thud. "Stay low!" Caleb roared over the din of gunfire. He knocked a small wooden plug out of a firing port carved into the log wall, sliding the barrel of his Henry rifle through the gap. He didn't fire wildly. He waited for the muzzle flashes in the tree line. Crack! A man outside let out a short, wet gargle and fell sideways into the snow. 11 left, Caleb muttered, working the lever action smoothly. The ejected brass casing clattered loudly against the floor. Cora scrambled across the furs, keeping her belly pressed tight to the ground. She reached the overturned table where Caleb kept his spare ammunition and a battered Colt Peacemaker. She checked the cylinder of the revolver, finding it fully loaded, and began lining up extra cartridges for Caleb's rifle. "They have us surrounded!" she yelled, wincing as another volley of bullets peppered the roof shingles. "They're cowards," Caleb grunted, firing again and drawing a sharp curse from the dark. "They won't rush the door. Croft wants to bleed us out." Outside, Gideon's voice echoed again, warped by rage. "Burn it. Burn the whole damn thing to ash. If I can't have the ledger, no one can." A primal dread seized Caleb's chest. The rhythm of his firing faltered. He watched through the narrow slit as a dozen torches flared to life in the woods, casting dancing, demonic shadows against the snow. The outlaws surged forward, hurling the flaming brands onto the dry cedar shingles of the cabin roof. Within seconds, the unmistakable, suffocating smell of burning pitch and wood smoke filled the small room. A fiery orange glow bled through the chinks in the ceiling. For Caleb, time stopped. The frigid air of the Bitterroot Mountains vanished, replaced by the suffocating heat of a summer night in Red Creek 5 years ago. He wasn't in his fortress anymore. He was standing outside his farmhouse, listening to the screams of his wife and brother, paralyzed by the wall of flames he couldn't break through. His massive hands began to tremble. The Henry rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. He stared blankly at the burning roof, tacitly, his breathing shallow and rapid. Cora saw the shift. She saw the mountain man, the invincible giant who had stood up to an entire town, crumbling before her eyes. "Caleb!" she screamed. She crawled to him, grabbing his heavy shoulders and shaking him violently. His eyes were wide, glassy, trapped in the past. A burning shingle collapsed onto the floor between them, showering them with sparks. Cora didn't hesitate. She drew her hand back and slapped him hard across the face. The sharp crack of her palm against his jaw echoed louder than the popping timber. "I will not burn!" Cora yelled, her face inches from his, her dark eyes blazing with a ferocity that rivaled the fire above them. "You hear me? You didn't buy me so we could die together in an oven. Fight! Look at me, Caleb. Fight!" Caleb blinked. The glassy sheen left his eyes, snapping back to the brutal reality of the present. He looked at the fire, then at the fierce, unbroken woman gripping his shirt. He drew a massive, ragged breath, the ghost of his past relinquishing its hold. "Under the rug," Caleb ordered, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "By the hearth. Move!" Cora threw aside the heavy bearskin rug. Beneath it, cleverly disguised among the floorboards, was an iron ring. She pulled it with all her might, revealing a dark, narrow trapdoor leading into a root cellar. The cabin roof groaned, preparing to cave in. "Down!" Caleb shoved her toward the hole, scooping up his rifle, the Colt, and the leather pouch containing Thomas's ledger. He tossed the revolver to Cora as she dropped into the dark. Caleb followed, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the roof's main support beam snapped, bringing a hellscape of burning logs crashing down into the living space. The cellar was suffocatingly tight, and smelled of damp earth and potatoes. But Caleb wasn't stopping. He pushed past Cora, moving to the far wall where the dirt was shored up by thick timber. He grabbed a shovel, resting in the corner, and began furiously tearing away the loose earth, revealing a narrow drainage tunnel barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. "I dug this my first winter," Caleb grunted, tossing the shovel aside. "Empties out behind the waterfall down the creek. Croft doesn't know it's here. I'll go first to clear the ice. Stay right on my boots." They crawled through the claustrophobic blackness, the icy mud soaking through their clothes. Above them, the muffled roars of Gideon's men cheering the inferno grew faint. The tunnel felt like a grave, pressing in on them from all sides, but Cora focused entirely on the rhythmic sound of Caleb's heavy boots shuffling ahead of her. After what felt like hours, a blast of freezing wind hit Cora's face. They emerged into the brutal night air, hidden behind the frozen cascade of a small waterfall. Caleb pulled her up, his chest heaving. From their hidden vantage point in the gorge, they looked up the ridge. The cabin was a roaring beacon of fire, sending a massive plume of black smoke into the starry sky. Gideon Croft sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, watching the structure burn with sick satisfaction. Caleb watched his sanctuary turn to ash. He had lost his home again. But as he looked down at Cora, who was clutching the ledger tightly to her chest, shivering but fiercely alive, a strange realization washed over him. He hadn't failed this time. He had saved her. "Let them think we burned," Caleb whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "We're going to Cheyenne." The journey to the territorial capital of Cheyenne was a descent into hell before a brutal climb back to life. With no horses, no provisions, and only the clothes on their backs, Caleb and Cora were forced to navigate the treacherous winter wilderness like hunted prey. For the first week, they survived on absolute stubbornness. Caleb trapped snowshoe hares using snares made from his own bootlaces. Cora showed him how to locate edible tubers buried deep beneath the frost line, a skill passed down from her grandmother. They shared the meager warmth of a single, makeshift lean-to, huddling together against the lethal night temperatures. The dynamic between them shifted profoundly in the harshness of the wild. The lingering shadow of the auction block evaporated, replaced by absolute, uncompromising equality. Caleb relied on Cora's sharp instincts and knowledge of the plains just as heavily as she relied on his brute strength and rifle. They were no longer a rescuer and the rescued. They were a singular, deadly unit. On the 8th day, their luck turned. They stumbled upon an outlying camp belonging to two of Gideon's hired trackers, who had been left behind to scour the lower passes just in case Caleb had escaped. The trackers were sitting by a roaring fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey, entirely oblivious to the two phantoms stalking them from the tree line. Caleb didn't give them a chance to draw. Moving with terrifying, silent speed, he dropped the first man with the butt of his rifle and disarmed the second before the outlaw even realized he was under attack. They bound the men to a pine tree, taking their heavy winter coats, their provisions, and, most importantly, their horses. "Tell Gideon we're coming for him," Cora whispered to the terrified bound tracker before swinging up into the saddle. Riding hard, they covered the remaining miles across the Wyoming plains, the brutal winter slowly giving way to the muddy thaw of early spring. Finally, the sprawling, chaotic skyline of Cheyenne rose from the horizon. It was a boomtown of progress, a jarring collision of civilized brick buildings, telegraph wires, and raw, untamed frontier dust. They rode straight down Capitol Avenue, drawing stares. They looked like wild specters, gaunt, wind-burned, and draped in stolen, blood-stained coats. They tied their horses outside the federal courthouse. Caleb pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping into a bustling hallway filled with lawyers, clerks, and lawmen. He approached the front desk, towering over a nervous young clerk. "We need the U.S. Marshal," Caleb demanded, his voice gravelly from disuse. "The Marshal is out of town," the clerk stammered, eyeing Caleb's rifle. "But his deputy is here." A door opened down the hall, and a man stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit with a polished silver star pinned to his vest. He possessed an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. It was Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves, a legendary lawman known for his incorruptible nature and deadly aim. Reeves adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, his sharp eyes taking in the battered duo. You folks look like you've walked through the devil's front door and kicked him in the shins. What can I do for you? Cora stepped forward. She reached inside her coat and pulled out the blood-stained leather ledger, placing it firmly on the polished wooden counter. My name is Cora, she said, her voice ringing clear and steady through the quieted room. And this is the rope that will hang Gideon Croft. Reeves raised an eyebrow. He picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages. As he read the detailed accounts of stolen federal payrolls, bribed officials, and ordered murders, his expression hardened into cold granite. Judge Isaac Parker has been trying to build a case against Croft for 3 years, Reeves murmured, looking up at them with newfound respect. This ledger is the missing piece. Where did you get this? Before Cora could answer, the glass windows at the front of the courthouse shattered inward in a deadly hail of gunfire. Screams erupted as clerks dove under desks. Caleb instantly tackled Cora to the floor, drawing his revolver as wood splinters rained down around them. Deputy Reeves didn't flinch. He drew his twin Colts with blinding speed, returning fire through the broken windows. Gideon, Caleb snarled, peering over the edge of the counter. Croft had realized his mistake. He had tracked them to Cheyenne, desperate to intercept the ledger before it reached federal hands. He was in the street with 6 of his most hardened killers, firing blindly into the building. Cover the back! Reeves shouted to the other deputies rushing into the hall. He looked at Caleb. You know how to use that Iron Mountain Man? I've been waiting 5 years to use it on him, Caleb replied, his eyes dark with vengeance. Caleb and Reeves moved to the front doors, kicking them open and spilling out onto the wooden boardwalk. A chaotic, brutal gunfight erupted in the muddy streets of Cheyenne. Bystanders scattered, horses panicked, and the air filled with the acrid stench of black powder. Caleb moved like a force of nature, his Henry rifle barking with deadly accuracy. He dropped 2 of Gideon's men in rapid succession. Reeves, methodical and calm, took down a third. Seeing his men falling, panic finally struck Gideon Croft. The smug, untouchable land baron realized his empire was burning to the ground. He spurred his horse, attempting to flee down a side alley. Caleb stepped off the boardwalk to take aim, but one of the dying outlaws in the mud raised his pistol and fired a desperate shot. The bullet tore through Caleb's side. He grunted, dropping to one knee as his rifle clattered into the dirt. Gideon saw Caleb fall. A wicked smile spread across his face. He hauled his horse around, drawing his pearl-handled revolver to finish the job he had started in Red Creek half a decade ago. Goodbye, Mountain Man, Gideon screamed. But Gideon had forgotten about the girl he bought for $2. Cora stepped out of the shattered doorway of the courthouse. She held the heavy Colt peacemaker Caleb had given her, gripping it with both hands. Her hands weren't shaking. Her eyes were locked onto the man who had ordered the death of her friend, who had put her on an auction block, who had burned Caleb's soul. Gideon swung his gun toward her, but he was a fraction of a second too late. I told you, Cora shouted, her voice cutting through the echo of the gunfire. I won't obey! She pulled the trigger. The heavy .45 caliber bullet struck Gideon dead center in his chest. The force lifted the outlaw out of his saddle, throwing him backward into the mud. He gasped, staring up at the Wyoming sky in utter disbelief as the darkness claimed him. Silence descended on the street, save for the frantic whinnying of horses. Cora dropped the gun, her chest heaving. She ran to Caleb, sliding into the mud beside him and pressing her hands against the bleeding wound in his side. I got you, she whispered fiercely, tears finally breaking through her stoic exterior. I got you. Caleb looked up at her, a weak, genuine smile touching his lips. He covered her trembling hands with his own massive, blood-stained fingers. I know, Caleb breathed. I know. The trial of Gideon Croft's remaining syndicate became the stuff of legend across the Wyoming territory. The blood-stained ledger, handed over by a nameless mountain man and a fierce native woman, brought down a corrupt empire that had strangled the plains for a decade. Deputy Bass Reeves ensured the federal government seized Croft's assets, paying out a massive reward to the 2 people who had braved hell to deliver justice. Caleb and Cora didn't stay in Cheyenne. The city was too loud, too crowded with ghosts. They took the reward money and rode back into the Bitterroot Mountains. They didn't return to the ashes of the old cabin. Instead, they found a new valley, higher up, untouched by the greed of lowland men. Together, not as master and captive, but as equals, forged in fire and snow, they built a new home, a fortress of peace, where the only law was the harsh, beautiful truth of the wild. If you were captivated by this incredible, pulse-pounding tale of survival, vengeance, and a romance forged in the fires of the unforgiving Wild West, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love historical drama and untamed frontiers. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of our thrilling historical deep dives. Drop a comment below. Would you have braved the blizzard to take down Gideon Croft? We want to hear from you.